Welcome back to another interview with the International Conflict Resolution Center. I'm Austin Clayton, the program director here at the center. Today we are having an interview with Philip Gamaghelyan from the University of San Diego. He's an assistant professor with the Kroc School of Peace Studies, teaching courses on conflict analysis, conflict resolution, mediation, and politics of memory, for example. Dr. Gamaghelyan is also experienced with peace building and dialogue exercises through the Imagine Center for Conflict, as well as the Caucasus Edition Journal of Conflict Transformation. So thank you again for joining us today. I'm looking forward to hearing your expertise. So to start with, just to kind of frame the situation, we are sitting on the one-year anniversary of the signing of the Trilateral agreement between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia. Initially, when this was signed, it was kind of viewed as a landmark achievement, but as we know, it didn't end the root of the conflict. It might have halted some hostilities, but it didn't even end those in the long run. I'd like to first start by just asking you what you maybe see as some of the priority issues that are really kind of festering and causing a lot of problems. I think on both sides, we can say that with the Azerbaijani side, one of the most important issues has been the issues of landmines, and for Armenians, it has been the return of prisoners from Azerbaijan. But as this is, a topic that you're very familiar with, I wanted to first start by just getting your opinion to see if there are any other major themes that we can be examining.
Sure. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Good to have the chance to have this discussion. Yeah, as you said, tomorrow marks a year since the end of hostilities, what we call the Second Karabakh War, essentially the very major escalation that took thousands of lives and ended, of course, completely redrawing the map of the conflict. And as you also mentioned, what it did, the November Trilateral Agreement, it ended the hostilities of that time, so the large-scale war itself. What it did not do, it did not end the conflict. It did not end the violent conflict, and as we see a year after, simply the ceasefire line is redrawn, a new actor, Russia, militarily is on the ground. The geopolitics of the conflict shifted, which we'll discuss, I'm sure, later, but it did not end the conflict. So and that has been long the concern of myself and many other analysts, that by saying that there is no military solution to the conflict, we didn't necessarily mean that there is no war in the future. Unfortunately, the war was quite predictable, but that the war will not, it will redraw the lines. It will create more victims, it will create further trauma. Yes, as we saw, the winners and losers might change, but it will not stop the conflict. And that's exactly where we are, and that creates a range of problems. Of course, some of them you mentioned. Yeah, mining is consistently raised as an issue on the Azerbaijani end. There is the prisoners of war are of course a very major issue for Armenia, and both of these are major humanitarian issues that absolutely need to be resolved, irrespective almost of whether we are in war or not. Frankly, even if there is a war, these are issues that affect people's lives and need to be addressed. But that's end of conflict, of course, then creates a whole other range of major challenges and issues that are of big priority. One is the kind of commitment to non-use of force as we move forward. That has been something that's been discussed throughout the time, right? And yet, of course, we never fully, at least in practice, committed to that. The arms race continues, and as we see, even within this year, there has been quite a bit of violence. So it's very similar to earlier years of a ceasefire time when there was no large-scale hostilities, and yet people were dying on a daily basis. It was creating immense insecurity, especially in border regions or areas of ceasefire lines. So that continues to be the major issue, and extremely important in my views, and I see it also being raised on the Armenian end, that the commitment to non-use of force as we move forward towards discussing whatever the future of the conflict and the peace process can look like. So that's, I think, the bare minimum. The humanitarian issues such as return of prisoners and commitment to non-use of force as we continue working towards some kind of a sustainable solution. Connected an issue or two, it's the rhetoric, hostile rhetoric that the hope was, at least from my end, when the war ended, that Azerbaijan now, since it's an winning side, could scale back the rhetoric. And sometimes you might think it is, because there are some neutral or positive messages coming, but overall it didn't. And there has been a lot of also steps taken, unfortunately, from the Azerbaijani side that continue feeding into hostile rhetoric, such as the park. There was this trophy park that raised a lot of international outrage as well. There were talks by the government officials, including high officials, about the territory of Republic of Armenia as an Azerbaijani territory, which then creates a sense on the Armenian side that there might be some form of claim that Azerbaijan is trying to lay towards Armenia's territory itself, and so on. So all of these are things that don't support at all any form of a peace process moving forward.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. I mean, for all angles, I mean, when you are emerging from a conflict and you immediately build a park that is dehumanizing the other side, that doesn't help it, simply put, it doesn't help anyone, but it definitely doesn't help when you are focusing on trying to, rebuild a narrative. Hopefully, I mean, we've had a lot of talk in the past year about opening of economic corridors, developing the region, but when you immediately, proceed that with something that's like, sticking it to the loser, kind of, it's not helpful for anyone, as we know.
And unfortunately, it's not the only example, and perhaps on the Armenian end, there is too much focus on that, but there have been things such as a postmark that seems to portray Armenians as a virus, and these things that are and any of these elements might not be noticeable in Azerbaijan, frankly, some of these things, but are highlighted in Armenia, and this is really all that the Armenian society sees. So that then creates a very particular image of Azerbaijanis as people who basically hate Armenians, with whom it's impossible to coexist. So yes.
Yeah, that's definitely something I wanted to get back to later on in our interview with the people-to-people component. But I guess keeping it at a government level for now, we've had a lot of statements coming out of both sides, as well as from Russia as well, stating that Russia's ready to mediate any conversation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but we really haven't seen anything too fruitful come forward in the past year. What kinds of things do you think are maybe the biggest factors holding back communication between the two states? Obviously, we just discussed a bunch of small items, but is it kind of a culmination of all these small pieces, or do you think there's one or maybe even two outstanding issues that are just really holding things back?
I would say the biggest challenge to moving forward is absence of direct negotiations, direct contact between the sides. And the secondary issue, or rather perhaps an issue that causes this absence, is a major breach of trust between the leaders. Early in post-2018, when Nikol Pashinyan's government came to power, there was direct contact established between Pashinyan and Aliyev, and there was also direct contact between their offices established. But that seemed to point towards the possibility of some kind of a direct dialogue that can help smooth some issues, but hopefully up to a point of discussing an agreement. But that didn't necessarily work out, and we have obviously the war. We had that long period, or a couple of years before the war, when there was no movement. So maybe from one side first, perhaps from Azerbaijani side, having higher expectations in terms of flexibility of the new Armenian government, perhaps that might have contributed to mistrust on the Azerbaijani end. And then the war, of course, it's a major breach of trust for the Armenian side. It's very hard now for Armenian leadership to accept the Azerbaijani government as reliable negotiating partner. So there's been a lot of breach of trust. The second issue connected with that personal contact established in 2018 is that in a way it replaced the more institutionalized form of negotiations. So prior to that, for the whole post-war, post-1990s war period, there has been the Minsk group of co-chairs, there has been an institute of negotiations, which wasn't necessarily, of course, leading towards a solution. In the last decade, at least, it was more focused on mitigating violence than on trying to find a solution. And yet it was a pretty major institutionalized framework where Russia, US, and France, together with the leadership of Armenia and Azerbaijan, were able to have open discussions and at the very least mitigate open violence. So kind of by shifting it to this more personal space, we have effectively the collapse of that institute. Was not the personal contact is not the only reason, of course. Again, that was on a downward spiral, but that in a way replacing. And since then, we don't have really any institutional form of negotiations between the two. We don't have institution of a negotiation, and we don't have a personal trust and contact that looked like might kind of take its place in 2018. So essentially, we have nothing. We have no communication. You have lower level contacts between deputy prime ministers of Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. It has been more active in an immediate post-war period. That slowed down quite a bit, but that's one mechanism. But again, one major issue is the structural absence of space to even discuss a solution or discuss even day-to-day humanitarian problems. So it's very hard to move anywhere while this isn't, the mechanism is not established and developed.
Definitely. While we're on the topic of the issue of trust in general, I'd like to ask for your opinion on the Russian peacekeeping contingent deployed in the region. I think we've seen a lot of developments very recently with that as well. You know, you just mentioned we don't have a space to facilitate dialogue between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Peacekeepers are kind of there to not only keep the physical peace, but start to draw governments in to have this conversation about various topics. We've seen a lot lately with, you know, a very diverging trend in opinion of peacekeepers, I guess. I believe it might have been last night that the Armenian president came out with a statement and said that it's best if the peacekeepers stay longer than 5 years, and they should pretty much always be there because we want to prevent conflict. I mean, that seems relatively benign on the surface, you know, to the average person, that you would want a peacekeeping force to prevent war. But when we look at the agreement itself, and we have this clause about, you know, if one party doesn't want peacekeepers after 5 years, they have to leave. And we're seeing increased frustration from the Azerbaijani side. How do you, you know, view this situation? Do you think it will become increasingly worse? Do you think there is a chance to kind of save the position of the peacekeepers, if you will? I just want to hear your insight on that as well.
So there are the day-to-day challenges of this peacekeeping, and then there's this bigger picture questions that you are asking. In the day-to-day, and this is important for the day-to-day operation of peacekeepers, is important for establishing trust in the peacekeeping mission itself, and overall in a belief that there is a stable enough ceasefire that we can then talk about bigger challenges and solve them. So there are, of course, questions of mandate, and it was not fully clear what the function of this peacekeeping force is. There, at least from the Armenian side, there was an assumption that the peacekeeping force should be located in between the two armed forces of the two sides, let's say, right? So this is where the peace needs to be kept, and yet they are primarily located on the roads, not necessarily, or in town or in population areas, but not necessarily in between the two armies. So that's there are a lot of instances of violence, then at least in the Armenian end, again, it leads to question of so what is the function? Why are the peacekeepers not keeping peace, essentially, if we do have violations of a ceasefire and casualties? So there's this first not clear fully mandate of what exactly is the role and function. And that has to be within a year, so hopefully sooner than later that will be clarified, at least to a point that the day by day peace could be kept, so the population that's stuck in the in areas that are close to one or the other military are suffering on a daily basis, which is still happening. Then there is a bigger question you are raising of the peacekeeping mandate in the long term, and here I think it's a much longer conversation perhaps, but what's the peacekeeping throughout the world frankly doesn't have a particularly good track record. It's been quite an imperfect mechanism, from the ability to keep the peace to the lack of clarity of the mandates, as in, is it an armed force that intervenes, or is it an observing mission? That was one of the actually sticking points in the negotiations, perhaps not the hardest one, but one of the ones throughout the whole 30 years of the Minsk Group negotiation process, that the peacekeeping mandate, peacekeeping force composition was never fully agreed on. Again, how long it would be, which countries will participate, right? Whether it will be armed force or observing mission. So again, it wasn't, the sides weren't able to negotiate this in ceasefire times over 30 years. So it's very hard to imagine that that could be agreed on in a crisis situation, as it was essentially in a matter of days decided a year prior to this. So I think that inevitably you have kind of more crisis management where a force enters by default, and then only we are working on the modalities of what that exactly that means. Yes, there was the 5-year initial period mentioned with a possibility of extension, and there are some provisions related to that. Again, whether it's a short-term, long-term, what does it mean to be there, even in short term, let alone in the long term, what exactly the function is, what exactly the role is. I think that all has to be negotiated. Frankly, I don't think that can be removed from this conversation from the bigger peace process conversation, because if we have a population, civilian population that is in physical danger, then some form of protection should be obviously discussed, and that makes the question of peacekeeping absolutely dependent on the solution of the conflict in general. So yes, if the conflict is solved, if there is an arrangement, political arrangement, security arrangement made that are keeping the population safe, then we can discuss removing peacekeepers. So without that, that's potentially another escalation, another round of violence. So I think again, so all questions that are absolutely interrelated and cannot be discussed one without the other.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I'd like to shift briefly just to some domestic political issues. So my next question is actually specifically about Pashinyan and his role in past affairs as well as future affairs. So I was actually living in Yerevan at the time of the Velvet Revolution, and it was very exciting. People were very excited to have change in the government and have a voice. People seem to put a lot of trust and confidence in him, in 2018. And then we kind of get to this post-war situation and the floor kind of falls out. And for obvious reasons, there's a lot of anger initially at Pashinyan for, people accusing him of selling out, of giving up, these sorts of things. But then we have a lot of analysts saying as well that he did make the right decision. And, he maybe is in a better position now than he would be if fighting continued, these sorts of things. So if you have any general comments on that, that would be appreciated as well. But I guess my more particular question goes down to the June elections. In the forecasting for the elections, people were not overly optimistic for his re-election, but then he had pretty decent margins, surprisingly. Do you think this is related to kind of a general attitude within the population right now? Is there kind of like a deeper meaning with this, where I think conflict is very, it's in the forefront of people's minds in Armenia. It's something that they deal with every day. So it's something that's on their mind when they go to the polls. But what kind of role do you think conflict had in Pashinyan's re-election, I guess, is maybe the clearest way of asking this.
I mean, frankly, if anything, the election showed that the conflict played a relatively little role, as surprising as it is, and as soon as it was after such a major defeat. So it's definitely is an important issue in Armenia, but clearly it ceded priority to a number of other factors. And so one is this very simple choice between at least some form of democracy, as imperfect as it is, that the Pashinyan's government represented, and autocracy and possibly dictatorship that was on the other side of the ballot. So it's the margin might have been much smaller and not as pronounced if the main opponent wasn't who it was, which was former President Kocharyan, who effectively campaigned on dictatorship. So he wasn't only presumed to be coming to take more autocratic rule, but he started increasingly campaigning openly towards establishing something like a dictatorship, abolishing civil society, or cracking down on freedom. So he was very openly campaigning effectively to becoming a dictator, not necessarily a president. And that's, I think, essentially then democracy won and a campaign for dictatorship lost. I think that was a very major part of a conversation on why you had actually last minute shift almost shown, because the polls were showing more 50-50. Yeah. Not 50-50, sorry, 20-20, which is an important distinction, race between the two. And then there were this 50-60% of undecided population who effectively weren't necessarily supportive of any of these two leaders. Mm-hmm. But then when the day came between the two, they chose not to go in the direction of possible dictatorship. So I think you can say the dictatorship lost rather than Pashinyan necessarily won. On that's one angle. There is a second angle of a conversation where I would argue that Pashinyan did win, and that could have been more predictable if we were looking outside of social media. Because when we are talking a lot about, yes, this anger and the noise, yes, there were protests in the streets, but the protests were very small, other than the first day or two immediately following the war, where it was a very major shock because Pashinyan government had absolute public relation fiasco by for 44 days, convincing population that Armenia is winning the war, only then suddenly, in a second, to announce that Armenia lost the war and that Nagorno-Karabakh, essentially big parts of the have been ceded to Azerbaijan through war. So that was a complete shock, and you had a big outpour of anger in the first day or two following the November 9 agreement. But then the protests continued, but they were very small. So they were actually, the government was blocking the streets, allowing the protests to freely continue, and there were very few people really showing up. So physically, you had a very little public participation in anti-Pashinyan protests. Social media was a whole other conversation. So if you were following primarily Facebook or Twitter, it would appear like there is a mass anger against Pashinyan and he's extremely unpopular. And yet the polls showed that was not the case, right? So I think we should distinguish again what's happening on social media, which is a lot of times paid, controlled at this point space, where those with resources can amplify their voice, and what actually people on the ground were thinking, who, when they showed up to the polls, clearly voted very differently from what the social media was showing. So I would say these two things, that the unpopularity of Pashinyan was heavily underestimated, or rather overestimated, based on the social media noise, and the second, that campaign for dictatorship failed. Yeah. But that also means that then the war, the conflict itself, as important as it is, at least had third priority to more domestic popularity of Pashinyan, who came after 20 years at least of authoritarian rule, and people's being fed up with it and not wanting to go back to that.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I guess with my final point with that, I just kind of want to transition into more of the, I guess, partially individual but partially collective role of things. I think you'll probably have some very insightful responses based on your experience with politics of memory. When we're talking about normalization of relations, this is obviously not something that is going to happen overnight, and it's going to take a very long time. We have a population of 3 million on one side and nearly 10 on the other. We've had many cases in the past of workshops, dialogues, all of these sorts of programs established to start facilitating communication on both sides of the conflict. now that we kind of have, officially a resolution, whether or not it holds, that's a whole other conversation, as we know. What sorts of things do you think can really be done to start facilitating people-to-people contact between Armenians and Azerbaijanis? Because it sounds like, both governments still have an agenda of items that they'd like to push. You can't really get fully transparent information, and it's really hard to bring people together without the government. But if the government has ulterior motives, it's also not necessarily going to be as effective. So wrapping all of that up in a nice little present, based on your experience with, facilitating dialogue, working with people on both sides of the conflict, and seeing, what processes work and what doesn't work, what would you recommend if we're trying to actually scale this up to a national level?
All right. So there have been questions of there were dialogues why they didn't succeed. So first of all, let me say that they were very minimal. There were a few initiatives here and there throughout years that brought some Armenians and Azerbaijanis together. But we need to put it in a perspective that it happened in the aftermath of complete ethnic cleansing on both sides and complete isolation of the populations. So you had effectively, when we talk about these millions of people, they had no contact for nearly 30 years. The only contact was some form of violence that they saw, or the propaganda on their, national in their national media and education. So the majority of the population were absolutely cut off from each other. So it was a very, very minimal contact organized by some NGOs in third countries. So yes, to the extent it could have mitigated something, it perhaps did, as in there are some networks that are still functional. But that it on its own could succeed in bringing peace probably should not have been ever a consideration. There should have been much bigger investment made into things like transitional justice, opening communication, right, trade, and so on between the two, so they could build relations where the coexistence would be possible. So again, it has been quite minimal before. Now it's even more limited for a number of reasons. One is, of course, we just had a war, and there is perhaps less support for it, but also the times changed. If in 1990s, 2000s, there was a very massive investment into civil society by the European Union and the United States of America. That support is also quite minimal again, compared to what we had in the past. So which means the resources for even this kind of people-to-people contacts aren't necessarily there, at least to the extent they used to be. So again, these are all on the negative end. Where I think we can still move forward is that there are areas where the governments need to cooperate, and essentially you cannot proceed too far without that. And this is gained from, of course, all the humanitarian issues we discussed, such as return of prisoners or demining, to establishing ceasefire, water sharing questions, which are also becoming major, and many others. So these have to be negotiated on a government level. But there are many other areas where governments are not in a position or might not have the resources or the time to invest, and where you have, it's quite necessary essentially to rely on a civil society. So this can be from a lot of humanitarian issues locally. So a lot of border areas face problems. A lot of people came back with PTSD, former fighters. A lot of people who, or simply people who were lost family members, were displaced, and need both financial, material, and psychological support. So this is, civil societies are much better positioned to handle these challenges than the governments. But also to reestablish a contact between the sides and to start building trust, as you mentioned, because currently the trust is probably at the lowest level ever. Because following the first war, you still had generations who coexisted essentially for decades prior. And the attitudes toward each other were not anywhere close to as negative as they are currently. Now you have a war with no relationship for a few decades. So it's a very, very low level. So really to establish trust, to start talking even about what's possible, but also to have a dialogue within each country to talk about what this normalization can look like. There is really so much the governments could do. So that is also something that there should be a conversation happening within each society and then between the societies. And that is all really areas that you need non-official track to contribute. So in my view, you cannot solve a conflict with civil society efforts alone, absolutely, but you also cannot have people live together in peace without civil society participation. So these two have to move together.
Yeah, so, definitely. So I guess just my final question to conclude this talk. I guess if you were last year looking towards the future, do you think this year was maybe more productive or less productive than you would have hoped? I mean, fortunately, we did not have any large-scale escalations. That we had a few skirmishes here and there, but diplomatically things were very quiet. Considering all of these things, were you expecting to have more things accomplished in 1 year, or are you were you expecting this?
Well, I guess the good news is there was as the war stopped, it stopped in a large scale at least. So there were some predictions or at least fears of descending into something like Syria, as in more continual war, with essentially the region falling apart with a lot of involvement of all kind of global and regional state and non-state actors. So we didn't go into the state collapse space, which is, I guess, a positive. Who knew? But at that point, it was hard to predict what will happen a year ago. On the negative end, I think the year has been wasted in a way also of not necessarily not solving anything. Probably it would be too soon to expect a solution, but to believe putting in place the seeds or the mechanisms that could help us solve it. Again, to compare it to 1991 and 94 war, they were very intense attempts to negotiate throughout the whole war. And by the time the war ended in 1994, the Minsk group was already in place. So there was a clear mechanism of negotiation, right institution with co-chairs, with a mechanism for whenever a solution happens, for support for a solution. None of this has happened in this period, and a year is a long time for, again, having a war and not being able to put in place a mechanism for a conversation. So that I consider a wasted time, and we can really analyze reasons for that, and it's probably not a short conversation. But that certainly is the biggest miss. And this is an area where potentially, US, European Union, so these actors who are essentially pushed out from the hard politics of the region as a result of the war, could have a contribution, and the contribution, I'm assuming, would be welcomed.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting to see, especially coming from a US perspective, US liking to get involved in every conflict and then running the opposite direction with this one. But maybe we'll see some changes coming up. We have, I believe that the next video conference between the leaders is next week. So there are rumors of signing border demarcation treaties of some sort, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that one exactly, but we'll see what happens. Thank you again for sitting down today and talking with us. This was really insightful, and I hope that our viewers can learn from this as well. It's always great to have firsthand opinion, insight. You have a lot of experience in the not just the political realm, but the peace building realm, and I think that's particularly valuable for any sort of conversation. So thank you again. I really appreciate it, and
thank you.
It's great having you. Thank you.